Good morning. I'm delighted to be able to present this initial keynote to this year's annual SEBDA conference. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share my thoughts, my feelings about this past year in particular, and the way in which this COVID pandemic has impacted upon not just our children and young people, but also us as the professionals, the parents, those who are nurturing them through what's been an incredibly traumatic time for many. In my session this morning, I want to really focus on this notion of catch up and really highlight the need for what I feel is an essential need for recovery at this current time. The conference theme initially is focused on mental health, now planning a positive future for our children and young people. So I think this fits very much with that theme, and hopefully what I'm going to be able to do is give you a very good grounding and introduction to some of the key problems, some of the key pieces of research that have been conducted during this last year, and highlight some of the specific needs that some of our children are currently experiencing. I think it's also going to hopefully provide an introduction as opposed to a real focus on specific interventions, which I know my esteemed colleague Helen Cowie will be introducing in her keynote this afternoon. So obviously that will give you far more in-depth understanding of what needs to happen based upon the evidence that we currently have in terms of interventions for our children and young people. So, from my perspective, I want to think about the impact of COVID specifically and what our response has been and what potentially it could be in the future, and highlight some of the difficulties, but also some of the possible opportunities that may be there for us now as professionals, as carers, and as nurturers. Bob's introduced me, so without too much fuss, I'm just going to flag up some of my publications here for Nurture UK in particular, because my key focus at the moment currently is on producing resources that are evidence-based, that really do make a difference, hopefully, to children and young people. But I have also worked for many years as a teacher, and currently am working as an educational and child psychologist, also as a therapeutic supervisor, supervising attachment workers and social workers who work with looked after children. I've also produced, obviously, many resources for Hinton House publishers, and I want to highlight the fact that anything that I talk about in terms of resources or tools that I've taken from these today, you will find in these publications. And also, obviously, there is a discount for SEBDA members if you wanted to investigate them further. So my key aim today, I want to clarify the need to connect, soothe and nurture as we return fully now, or partially for some, to the classroom learning context. And I'm going to hopefully make a case in psychological terms for the rejection of any notion of what we are seeing as labelled as academic catch-up. And also not buying into this current narrative, which I feel really does sadly pathologise all our children and feeds them this message that they will all now have fallen behind, that they'll all be at risk of severe mental health difficulties, both now and in the future. I'm going to make quite a strong argument for that. I also would like to provide a framework for building a whole school ethos of recovery and the ways that we can all effectively resource that recovery curriculum. And I'm going to think about these 3 R's, the rules, the resources and the rituals that I feel really do build mental health and well-being at a whole school level, and really ensure what I call relational safety, self-efficacy, connection and a sense of hope. And I really do hope that at the end of this keynote, there is a sense that we can envisage a way forward that is full of hope and connections and compassion for both ourselves and our children and young people. I'm also going to hopefully generate thinking around the need to develop more flexible, blended learning opportunities, more nuanced approaches and whole school frameworks for mental health support in-house, and the way in which we actually educate, teach and provide children and young people with access to their curriculum. This study, the most, I think, possibly study that I would suggest needs to be reflected on in the most depth is the Oxford Co-Space study, because this has been ongoing throughout the whole of the pandemic and has been tracking children and young people and their families in terms of measuring their well-being, their mental health. They've used the SDQ, of course, which everyone in this audience will obviously have some knowledge of, to measure attentional, emotional, behavioural responses as children navigate their way through this last year and these lockdown periods. And they found that obviously children's mental health at the start of this year in January did increase again. And this was especially the case in primary aged children. And also the proportion of secondary aged girls with emotional problems increased significantly too, due to or in response to the new lockdown in January. So there is some clear evidence coming out here of the impact of these lockdowns on young people's mental health throughout the age range. And I also know, obviously, from my own work, my own professional experience, and that of colleagues working in CAM services, and specifically with those with eating disorders, that there has been a 46% increase in referrals to services for those with eating disorders. So that, again, is a significant development over this last year. And the profile, again, has been changing. Prior to this pandemic, the majority of the cases would have been girls. And now 48% of the caseload is apparently boys. So there is a shift here that's gone on. And the impact of the lockdown periods in particular has had an impact on our boys and young men. We conducted, myself and 3 colleagues, also educational and child psychologists, a small-scale study in my local authority here in Kent, looking at responses of children in high schools to the pandemic, and specifically the impact of the 3rd lockdown. So I just want to present this to give you a flavour of some of the things that they felt they were missing, some of the experiences that they had that they felt really did impact upon them quite negatively. And this is from Jodie. Obviously her name has been changed in terms of, an ethical response in terms of research. So I just want to just highlight the fact that her stresses around this were really around what is going to happen in terms of my exams, in terms of my A-levels, how am I going to be assessed? How is this going to happen? Who's going to actually be marking me? How is this going to be fair? Is all the work that I've done going to go for nothing? What's going to happen in terms of my future? And I think she's felt a great level of frustration about the whole impact of COVID and the fact that we're still seemingly, from her perspective, in the same situation as we were this time last year. And she also highlighted the fact of the lack of contact, the lack of connection. And I think this is a huge theme. It's a really big issue for our young people. The fact that they missed out on the routines, the rituals, all the things that they would normally expect to do in terms of those rites of passage, but also unable to actually see and communicate with my friends in person. That was incredibly difficult for them. He also highlighted, sadly, a lack of understanding in the school context, in her specific context, on the part of staff members and the way in which they were engaging online and not having actually opportunities to talk about issues, to actually reflect on issues and feel that they were supported in terms of their mental health. She talked about the fact that they were using mental health a lot in terms of actually talking about it, mentioning it, but without actually giving any concrete support or advice. What they eventually did do in response to some requests from the young people was to actually give 10-minute breaks between sessions throughout the day so that they could actually move around, get a drink, use the toilet, etc. So there was a response, but of course this is not the response that most of us would want to see, and it certainly didn't do anything in terms of supporting her or alleviating some of the anxieties that she had. And some more quotes. And I think this first one highlights this notion that children missed out on these rites of passage. So I missed out on the end of year prom. We really missed out on so much, and we feel that. My grades were okay, but I just feel I could have done more better if I'd had the chance. So there's a sense of regret that I could have done better if I had been in school with teachers around me, really physically around me, so that they could help and support me and notice when I was finding things difficult. Alfie talks about just being fed up, basically, and I think we've all experienced that over this last year, missing being with friends, missing those social contacts. And also from Louise here, feeling anxious and about going back to school, feeling anxious about being back in school after the lockdowns. And I think for many of the children and young people that I have worked with, mainly online over this last year, this has been a real issue. For some of our children on the continuum, there has been something very special about being at home. It's actually prompted them to feel more secure, to engage in more learning, because they haven't had to contend with many of the issues that they find difficult in the learning context, being overstimulated, having to socially interact with people that they find difficult. And I think for some of our children, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that they have actually thrived to some extent. In February of this year, the growing narrative became really, really evident in my view. It was when the NFER reported the significant learning loss of Year 2 pupils that they'd measured in terms of COVID-related school closures. And they highlighted, based on maths and English scores, that children have, quote, fallen behind. And they also highlighted this importance of continuing to invest in catch-up activities to enable them to recover the learning that they had lost. So this notion of catch-up actually, in my view, emanated specifically from that report and then translated into this notion of lost learning. Now, the Institute of Fiscal Studies really announced this notion of all of our children, on average, having a lifetime earning loss of £40,000 each as a result of this loss of learning. It's very, very interesting. I really cannot say, hand on heart, that looking at the way in which they formulated this, that there is any kind of real evidence that this is the case. And I don't think, it's almost like this figure was plucked out of thin air to some extent. And I think this is really, really difficult. These headlines that we've been assimilating, that our children have been absorbing through the media, are really hard-hitting, and they can't be unread or unheard or unsaid now by adults or our children and young people. There is an absolutely fabulous podcast by Lakhani. It's called Rethinking Education. And I want to highlight this now because I think there is an issue, but also an opportunity for us here to stop and to rethink what we're actually doing at this point in time within this pandemic going forwards. He said, "What planet are you on if you think the purpose of education is to provide 9 or 10 GCSEs that fail a third of our children from the outset?" And I think this is really important because in my view and in Lakhani's view, at its most basic level, our education system is essentially an exam-based peer ranking scheme. What it's designed to do is determine who should succeed, who should fail. And what does it favour? We know this. It favours the academic and it penalises the creative and the neurologically diverse, possibly the children and young people that most of us aligned to SEBDA and other institutions that actually foster the well-being of those with special educational needs really, really need to be highlighted. It does favour the children who are neurologically not diverse. So I think this is really important to factor into our thinking. We know that in this pandemic, many children who've been at home have not had a bad time. Okay, this is really important to highlight. Many of them have had the opportunity to diversify, sprawl out across a really wide range of topics and learn stuff that has been really, really interesting, stimulating, creative, and made this huge amount of connections between knowledge, real world experience. And what's sad about this is that it's all being left unmeasured and unacknowledged and uncelebrated by this current system. which really does favour those who are not neurodivergent. Really, really important to remember this. So this kind of rigid educational system that we've got, with that kind of learning, we can't actually measure it. And children are therefore being told that notwithstanding all of that stuff, they are falling behind. And also what has to be highlighted, and I'm sure that this will come up this afternoon in Helen Cowie's presentation, it is really incredibly unforgivable at this current stage that we still have 30% of children in this country living in poverty. They don't have the access to resources that many of us take for granted, the internet, etc. And so, of course, motivation is likely to have plummeted in that specific group. We know this because what we're focusing on are those essential needs, you know, food, safety. This stuff has to be addressed first, and we know this. We absolutely are clear about this. What these children don't need now is more pressure, extended school days, catch-up curriculums, being pushed and pushed into something that they're not emotionally, socially ready for at this current time. I think what we really need now, and what our children and young people deserve, is a real urgent education reform, much like the Education Act in 1944, with access to resources, a reliable connection to the digital world. Many of the children that I've worked with in Kent, in my local area, from one of our high schools, have not had the access to the internet, have not been able to go online to learn. This is disgraceful in this day and age, in my view. They need that. They also need to be fed, they need to feel safe, they need to feel supported and believed in. It's from that basic foundation of nurture and nourishment that I feel very strongly that all our children can and should be able to flourish. And I think it's really important that the parents, teachers, communities and government, we really need to embrace this reality that there's more to education than learning maths, English, and our children and young people's test scores and the need to essentially catch up academically. It's really, really important that we are the ones that act as their guides, mentors and champions and really do adopt that approach. So are we now on this road to recovery? Robert Halfon, MP for Harlow and chair of the Education Select Committee, was speaking in February of this year. And I quote, he said, "In the past, the mantra has been education, 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 and university, university, university. Now, our focus must be on catch up, catch up, catch up, and skills, skills, skills." No, in my view, no. What our focus needs to be on now is to repair relationships, repair our young people's self-esteem, and repair their well-being, for many which has been damaged to some extent. And to build confidence, to rebuild those connections with us, the adults in the school community, and with each other, with their peers, and also to build a sense of safety, because essentially without that sense of safety, none of us, adults or children alike, are going to be able to engage cognitively in any sense whatsoever. And I think it's important as well that at this time we need to be thinking about flipping the script. We know that approximately 30% of our children will be displaying significant difficulties at this time in terms of their mental health and well-being. But we also know on that continuum, there are many children, young people who will be able to flourish essentially very, very quickly and will need probably access over time to a significant adult in the school community, but they will have an underlying level of resilience that enables them to cope and navigate through all the potential traumas to come and the changes that we are all currently navigating at this time. Let's try and shift the narrative a bit here. I think it's really important. This labelling, the COVID generation, the failing and failed generation, the need for catch-up generation, let's just shift that slightly. These are the COVID survivors. They're resilient. They've got through it, they're getting through it, they're compassionate, flexible. Look at what they've had to do over this year in terms of changing the way they learn and interact. They're adaptable. This is not a lost generation, and it's really important that we shift the narrative, in my view, at this current time. We need to build on this and not marinate our children in anxiety. There is some good news, of course. The CoSpace study has highlighted this. This was the last report published this month, report number 10. And they've shown that children's mental health symptoms have decreased quite significantly from February to March of this year. And essentially, look at the graph here. It's a direct result, obviously, of this lockdown easing. And for many of us, this will have been the case. So there is hope here for many of our children and young people. Not unexpected outcome, of course, is that 1 year into this pandemic, the children and young people from households with lower incomes and those with special educational needs continue to show elevated mental health symptoms. So this is why I'm saying be careful about going down the pathologizing route, but think essentially about this on a continuum. Those children from these households who are already suffering and already had real problems and difficulties to contend with have had much, much worse outcomes as a result of this pandemic. And these are the children who will need bespoke interventions, in my view, going forwards. I developed this real COVID catch-up plan as a direct response to this whole narrative around lost learning, the need, to catch up. So I just want to briefly go through it, and you can access this. If you follow me on Twitter, you can download any of these resources that I tend to just post them because I think it's useful for people to be able to access them relatively quickly. So COVID catch-up, for me, compassion has to be central now for us in our interactions, because without this sense of safety, none of us are open to learning or academic catch-up, children and adults alike. We know that as a direct result of anxiety and traumatic experiences, our organisational skills, language, planning, self-regulation, all of this may have been compromised and negatively impacted upon. This kind of heightened stress that we've experienced ongoing will make a real difference. So it needs to be that all of us focus on regulation first, because without that regulation, none of us are going to be able to learn or interact appropriately in the social context. We also need to be talking to our children, young people, far more, listening to them. The voice of the child needs to be paramount here. What are they telling us they need? We mustn't impose that on them. They'll let us know if I need catch up with my reading, my writing, my spelling, or if I need catch up socially in order to be able to engage with my friends again. We need to celebrate some of the lockdown learning, some of the stuff that would go unmeasured, and highlight this. Really, really important. And I would never say ever to dismiss a child's fears or anxiety. We need to be clear about this, very much listening to their worries at this point in time, but making sure that the right intervention is there. It is a continuum. Not every child is going to need a therapeutic intervention. And essentially, we need to cancel that narrative of the lost generation. This is really unhelpful. It just promotes, in my view, despair and depression. So we affirm their levels of flexibility, their steadfastness, resilience, kindness, creativity, their sheer grit that has enabled them to get to this point and return into the learning context. They need to value those strengths and remember that these are the strengths that are going to see them through in the future too. They've managed to learn how, many of them, to cope with fears, to cope with anxiety in a much more proactive way. So we need to reinforce that. We're there for them. If they haven't been able to do that, we can support them to do it going forwards. I also think it's important to understand that this is a time for innovation. There's a real possibility here when we look at the way in which some of our children have really thrived learning in the home context. And they've really developed skills enormously well in terms of, for example, spelling and reading and writing for some of our children. They've had more time to go back to look at the PowerPoints to reinforce some of those skills. And they've thrived emotionally as well. Don't forget this, it's really, really important. This is a time for us to perhaps think about more blended approaches going forwards and think about more nuanced approaches, particularly to the neurodivergent groups. Very, very important here. And also promoting a genuine sense of hope. I think we need a new narrative now which celebrates our really wonderfully compassionate, caring COVID generation. They can succeed as long as we, the adults, are brave and creative enough to challenge and flip what I call this catch-up narrative. At the start, what we need to focus on if we're thinking about this notion of recovery and catch up emotionally is to build resilience. And education is one part, it's one domain of resilience. The secure base, social competencies, positive values, reflecting on and building talents and interests and friendships are the other 5. So it's very important that we go forward with a balanced approach as we navigate this current situation. And also not lose sight of the fact that there is a change curve here. Okay, if we look back at the Kübler-Ross change curve, it can be helpful in my view. So creating alignment, maximising communication, sparking that motivation again that our children and young people will need in order to engage and develop their capability to do that so that we can share our knowledge, share our experiences. Ultimately, we will integrate back. The changes will be integrated and there will be a renewed sense of us as individual human beings. And I think it's really, really important that we don't lose sight of this. But also, obviously, we as practitioners and professionals, all of us here at this conference today online, will be very aware of the groups of children and young people that we are supporting. And I would suggest that for most of us, these will be at the top end of this continuum. So these will be the young people who we need to be very clear about ensuring that they have access right away to the most appropriate interventions and approaches. I do think that there is a heightened risk of children experiencing emotionally based school avoidance. And we know what that looks like in terms of increased anxiety, punctuality, their negative approach and talk about school, reduced engagement and some atypical behaviours. And also, of course, displays of anxiety, anger, stress, all of which actually comorbidity here we need to reflect on. You know, most of our anxiety is displayed as anger and frustration. So there is a risk here and we need to look for those warning signs for our children and young people. We know when emotionally based school avoidance usually occurs, and that's during transitions, usually from primary to secondary school. If there's been a bereavement or significant loss or change within the family, if there's been a significant change in friendship groups, or there's been bullying that the child has experienced, or a prolonged absence. Now, looking at that list, you can see clearly there's a real resonance here between those characteristics and experiences and the COVID pandemic. All of those triggers can be associated with the pandemic in ways which probably need no further illustration. So I do think that we can predict, based on that there will be more pupils and families struggling with this particular issue at this time. And also the impact specifically on those with anxiety has been more significant. We know from the Mental Health Foundation study that those with mental health difficulties prior to the pandemic have experienced very, very significant increases in mental health issues during this last year. And this is ongoing for many of them. So separation anxiety, social anxiety, generalized anxiety, and health anxiety, including OCD. I mean, just think about it on a practical level here. If you have been working in a therapeutic relationship with someone attempting to reduce, for example, your hand washing, now it goes without saying that, of course, this has really undone a lot of that work, because we're now giving the children, young people, exactly the opposite message, which is be afraid of this, keep washing your hands, keep everything clean. So there's going to be ongoing some very real issues for some of our children and young people. That means essentially for us as the professionals, and of course as parents, carers, we need to really understand anxiety and provide the right kind of emotional support so that children don't get into this negative cycle of behaviours. Because the more that we avoid that situation that we're fearful of, we know that the more that the anxiety increases. We avoid, it reduces, we then get that build up once again. We know what helps in schools in terms of early identification, positive relationships and peer relationships, having that designated area to retreat to, and not a sin bin, not somewhere where there's any sense that you're the person who's actually not coping. This is about emotional support. This is about nurture. So obviously I passionately believe that this should be a nurture group in every single school. Trusted adults negotiating the staggered return, and let's face it, it's got to be staggered. I think it's really, really important when I'm talking about this flexibly. We need to be very clear here. Nuanced approaches that step by step enable traumatized children back into the school community. I would never, for example, throw a child into a swimming pool if they were frightened of the water, if they were frightened of not being able to swim, for example, they couldn't do it. They're not going to thrive, they're not going to be able to cope, they'll drown. And in exactly the same way, I would never ever throw a child back into a school community when they were absolutely petrified and had heightened levels of anxiety. We need to be very clear about this step by step within the context of a really well organised, responsive SEN department, but also ensuring that every team member, every staff member in every school has a real genuine understanding of this particular issue and problem and knows how to respond appropriately, so they don't undo all the good work of those who are supposedly more specialist. So teaching all staff self-regulation skills training and therapeutic techniques for anxiety, in my view, is really an essential. And this is not about ensuring that all our staff members become therapists or have a real specialism in this area, but it's about being very clear. Every one of us will have become less regulated over this last year. We'll all find it difficult. But as adults, we need to be able to regulate ourselves in order to be able to co-regulate with our children and young people. So maybe, you know, this is about, at this current time, ensuring that staff also have access to a really comprehensive support system and training package, led obviously by your mental health leads. So something like the wellbeing toolkit for mental health leads from Hinton, absolutely crucial, because it actually covers in the modules things like attachment, trauma, bereavement, grief, loss, emotionally based school avoidance, how to use specific tools for mindfulness, how to manage anxiety. And I think this is important. We need some awareness, some understanding, so that in our interactions with our children and young people, we can actually model this. There are many resources, clearly there are, and I'm just highlighting a few of mine, particularly the Toolbox of Wellbeing and the recovery toolboxes. What someone said to me last week was, I'm having to do so much at the moment. We've got exams, we're not actually being paid for doing the marking anymore. We've got all of this stuff in terms of different ways of approaching our children, young people. We've got lots of children with EBSA. And also I'm supposed to develop a recovery curriculum. How am I going to do that? Don't have the resources. It's not something that we planned. I think it's really, really important. A recovery curriculum that helps us to teach regulation skills is twofold. There are two prongs to this, two aspects to it. One is actually content in terms of how we teach self-regulation, and the other is the whole school approach, the ethos, how it feels to be here, how the systems in the school help us to remain regulated. So very, very important. We don't essentially have to recreate the wheel. There are plenty of resources out there we can pick up to actually use with our children and young people. There are some new ones from Hinton, which I'm just flagging up here, the recovery toolbox, that specifically designed for those age groups. I'm a great believer in this. I think it's really, really important. People should not have to be recreating the wheel, particularly at a time when we are all facing a great deal more work. It's more stressful for us. So I'm hoping that these will be very useful going forward. Because ultimately, recognising and supporting anxiety due to the social isolation that many of our children have experienced and the lockdown periods that they've had to undergo, COVID itself is really, really important. It's a continuum. So rejection, as I said earlier, of this pathologising narrative is essential in my view, but understanding anxiety for all of us is now an absolute imperative. We've got to do it. Years ago when I was working with a young woman and I asked her to explain what her anxiety felt like. She described it as a brick wall, something that she couldn't get through or around. She just could not cope with it. It just felt as if it was straight in front of her. She couldn't manage it. When I asked her to talk about what it would look like if she could manage it just a wee bit, what that would look like, what it would feel like, she said it would be like having that brick wall converted into a staircase. So small steps, step by step. Very often when we talk to our children about what they want to do, where they want to be, we talk about making goals. I am actually really pushing that aside at this current time and saying, really, what I'm talking about are small steps, because that's all most of us can manage and cope with. Let's make it small steps, step by step back into school, step by step back into learning, step by step. And at each step of the way, having the resources and the interventions that help me to get to where I want to be. I want to move from one side of the bridge to the other. I want to move from what Martin Seligman would call learned helplessness into a place where I feel much more in control, as if I can manage. So it's essential that everyone, both inside and outside of the school community, understands how anxiety manifests itself and never goes down the route of actually describing a child's behaviours as being angry, frustrating, defiant, etc., really negative. You know, this is all simply a display of anxiety. So we must never, ever punish our children for displaying anxiety or symptoms of trauma. What do we do to start with? We need to focus on, in my view, what we can control and not what we cannot control at this point in time. So I know I can control the way I behave, the way I social distance, my kindness to other people, how I ask for help, how I stay in touch, my routines, exercise, etc. I can't actually control any of the things in that outer circle, how other people behave, how long COVID lasts, because obviously we know we're going to have new variants going forward. We're going to be living with this forever now, as we live with flu and other viruses in the world. I can't also control other people's reactions, the economy, etc., etc. They're outside my control. So let's just shift away and focus on what we can control now. And what we can do, essentially, to reduce anxiety for our children and young people and for adults in our school communities. And I think there are 8 keys here, in my view. The first one is providing structure and routine. Routine and structure, we know, reduces anxiety. And also exercise, play and free time. There's a huge amount of research going on at the moment about the importance of play for our children and young people, particularly being conducted by those in the educational and child psychology community. It's absolutely essential. If we're going to have catch up at this moment in time, I would like to see catch up with play. Our children have missed out on the social aspects, the playing aspects, being free, experiencing flow. Also, quality time together, they've missed out on that. That reduces anxiety. Limiting access to news, both for children and ourselves, and reflecting on the positives, focusing on those. Maintaining and building and reconnecting, getting those attachments back again with significant adults who love us and support and nurture us. And also looking after ourselves. It's really, really important, this notion of self-care. Many people kind of say, oh, no, not self-care again, you know, it's a bit cheesy. Actually, no, it's not. I sincerely mean this when I say we need to put ourselves first. We need to look after ourselves. We need to make sure that we're okay, because otherwise we're not going to have the energy we need to support and nurture our children at this time. What do we do when we notice a child is being anxious? We listen. We empathize, we validate. In essence, we become what I call emotional coaches. We use emotional coaching, emotion coaching, as Gottman outlined it in his work. So we teach them how to label their emotions, and we normalize them for this. It's okay if you feel like this, whilst also providing them with opportunities to learn how to self-regulate. So specific breathing techniques, mindfulness, how to challenge the cycles of negative automatic thinking that they may engage in. Really, really important stuff for them. If we're answering those anxious questions, we've also got to be very authentic. We've got to be honest and present them with facts, not fiction, and make time to talk. Very often, because we're stressed and rushed, we don't actually allocate the time, and children feel it. We know this straight away when we're not actually listening because we haven't made the time to do it. We need to check in daily with our kids now, taking that emotional temperature of the class at the start of each session, very, very simply, but never dismissing the question, the thought, the emotion. It matters to them and it should matter to us. We need to be curious now more than ever and help children, young people, to analyse, gently challenging perhaps some of their thinking that's erroneous, remembering, of course, that our thoughts are not always facts. We get it wrong. We need to learn how to kind of really think about that in a more deeper, profound way, providing safety and nurture, of course, at the outset. So the safety aspect, telling them, I'm here for you, I'm staying here, you're going to be okay. Physiology, actually supporting the child to understand this is going to pass, your body's responding in an anxious way, give it a minute or two, it's going to go. You've been through it before, you can do it again. And of course, validation. It must be so hard. I'm sorry this is making you feel nervous. It sounds so hard. Do you want to talk it through? It's not silly you feel like this. It matters. I can see you're worried. How can I help you right now? And of course, many of you will be making use of self-regulation activities. You will have programs for this. There are a huge number of resources out there. So I just want to flag up the importance of breathing exercise and teaching breathing exercises to our children, young people. These are just a few from the toolbox of well-being. So ball breathing, straw breathing, the birthday cake, hand breathing, tracing your fingers at one at a time and counting to 5 as you breathe in, 5 as you breathe out. Very, very simple things, particularly for our younger children, that they can use the moment they begin to feel a heightened level of anxiety, because it's that first minute response that matters, in my view. What are my strategies for that first minute? Also, simple grounding exercises. There are a huge number of these available in a variety of resources, but very important that we teach our young people to do this. We can only do that, mind you, of course, if we do it for ourselves too. We need to model this. We need to be able to engage with them so that we can co-regulate with them. Progressive muscle relaxation, again, there are a huge number of CDs apps available on relaxation, just as there are on positive thinking, managing anxiety, the Calm Harm app, etc. So please make reference to these. Please make sure that you have this stuff at your fingertips so that you can pass it on to our children and young people and punctuate their school day at the moment with opportunities to regulate. Testing our thoughts, challenging our negative thoughts, finding the evidence for and against those thoughts that are chandeliering, that are overgeneralization, that are catastrophizing, is really, really important. So just a simple framework for this, finding the evidence for my thought, my negative thought, against it. What would my friends say? What would I say to my friend if he or she had this thought? And recognizing how the cognitive shift therefore takes place at that point. I can now think, well, if I was going to say that to my friend, why am I not saying this to myself when I have that negative thought? Let's write this down. Let's have that positive mantra on my little post-it note or postcard. Let's put that somewhere safe so that I can pull it out when I engage in that negative thinking next time. So having a plan for that, clearly understanding, of course, that everyone's toolbox for well-being, for mental health, is going to be different, and knowing that we teach this range of self-regulation strategies, but we also ensure that the child or young person has time to reflect specifically on what works for them. So importantly, we need to be thinking about these 3 R's of routines, resources, rituals and rules within the school day and within the social home context too. And every one of us at this point in time needs to have what I call a healthy daily platter. This is from the work of David Rock and Daniel Siegel. So thinking about the amount of sleep, physical, focus time that we have, the time to connect, to play, downtime, and actually time in when we're focusing, concentrating, engaging and learning. This has got to be balanced, and we need to spend some time, more time at this point, I think, reflecting on what this looks like for us as the adults and for our children and young people. And those routines are incredibly important. As I said earlier, it's a key. One of the keys to reducing anxiety is to retain routines, very, very important. So making sure that we activity schedule, that we have those flow moments during each day where we do things that just take our mind away from any of our worries, that we have games, we have talk time, we have time just to chill. And we also have time to engage in creative activities, reducing the level of screen time, linking in, but ensuring that we actually really do that in a positive way. Those rituals, those mindful moments, self-soothing, connection times, again, very, very important that we engage in those. And also thinking about the 3 A's. At this point, I think we need to make sure, as I said earlier, that every member of the staff team understands anxiety, what it looks like, how it manifests itself, and how best to manage it for both our children and our young people and ourselves at this current time. We also need to focus on how we make everything accessible. Some of our children and young people will need ongoing, a more nuanced approach to engaging with the curriculum. And they need to make sure, and we need to make sure, that this is wholly accessible to them and it's really individualized and bespoke to their needs. And also attunement. We need to be more attuned to each other and more attuned to our children and young people. Providing advice on managing personal anxiety is really, really important. And I think now that all of our children, regardless of where they are on this anxiety continuum, will need some level of support going forward. Some will be fine with initial conversations, a bit of a catch up now and again. Some will need something that's far more bespoke, but every one of them could benefit, I think, in my view, from developing their own anxiety support plan. Now, you might not want to call it that. You could call it my wellbeing plan, my mental health plan, whatever. But it's important. What it is about finding out what works for you as an individual, young person or adult. There are no right or wrong answers. So you ask the child or young person just to simply write down everything that they think would help them at this current time, what is working for them in terms of managing their anxieties, their negative thinking, even if those things seem a bit strange or odd. And then try to be really specific as possible, because it makes it easier then to follow any plan when those anxious feelings seem to be taking over. And also recognizing the need for flexibility. We will need to change these plans over time and just reject some of those things that might not be working appropriately. So a framework for this might look as follows. What are my triggers? What makes it worse? What helps? When is it not so bad? So in solution-focused terms, finding the exceptions. What small steps can I take now? And that's important, small steps. As I said earlier, anxious people can't do the big ones. 3 things that I can do to calm myself straight away, and things I can do every day to look after my well-being. So this is my activity scheduling, my well-being plan for the week. People that I can go to for help, to talk to, that needs to be clearly identified, and listing of any websites, helplines or text lines that you might find helpful. Now that's essential. One of those needs to be available 24/7, because that young person, that child or adult might not want to actually access support during the day. It needs to be available throughout the day, because you might feel anxious at 3 a.m. in the morning and feel overwhelmed at that point in time. Ultimately, it's about building the toolbox, building a toolbox of well-being. So many different strategies and ideas here. The best breathing, grounding, anxiety ladders, all of this stuff. Really, really important that we build that toolbox, both for ourselves and for our children and young people. And as I said earlier, it's really essential. This needs to be something that works for me. It won't work maybe for you or for everyone else. And that's the same for our children and young people. Find out what works and keep trying new things, but they need to be presented with all of these strategies, in my view. I'd also flag up the power of nurturing here, and the power of journaling our children and nourishing them and nurturing them through that process. It's really important that whatever we do in terms of self-regulation, looking after our mental health, it has to work for us. It has to nourish us and ours. If it doesn't, then we just don't do it. And I think this is really, really important. I am a great believer in journaling. It really does help for me as a reflective practitioner. I think it's an essential. So just that whole structure that keeping a journal provides us, the opportunities to reflect on 3 good things, what went well, the 3 W's at the end of the day, what helped me, is really, really vital, because too much of what we do at the end of the day, we reflect on the negatives, many of us. So this is really, really powerful tool. Planning 3 kind acts for the next day. What could I do differently tomorrow in terms of managing my anxieties? What affirmations am I going to write down now and read again before I go to sleep? Very, very important. Journaling, we know from the research, can help us in terms of improving mental health and well-being, recording and savouring special moments, which is really great, managing or reducing our stress levels. It can improve our confidence and self-esteem as we flag up the good bits about ourselves in our daily lives. It can help us to build those social connections and support us also in processing some of those problems that we might experience on a daily basis. And what underpins it, in my view, is this Gibbs reflective cycle model, which seems somewhat dated, but still use it in terms of educational psychology practice on the training courses, because we keep our reflective log on our placements on a daily basis. And I think this is essential, describing what happened, what were my feelings, how am I evaluating that? What was good or bad about the experience I had today? What sense can I make of it? What was going on there? What else could have done in that situation? And also developing action plans. If it arose again, what would I do? What would I do differently? So it's positive. It's a positive framework. It's a problem-solving framework. And in terms of developing affirmation practice, really, really useful new resource from Nurture UK I want to flag up is this particular inspirational words to promote and nurture well-being. And again, I'm flagging it up because I think Nurture UK resources are extremely useful, very user-friendly and practical, but something that can actually be just lifted up and used straight away. So in terms of being able to do and deliver this kind of intervention and approach and whole school approach, I think it's important that we reflect also on that 3rd A of attunement, because no significant learning takes place without those significant relationships. And at the moment, I think more than ever in our school communities, there is this need for what I call the authentic, connected, therapeutic, and I would add to that, compassionate adult. Supporting those children at the top end of that continuum in particular to process and understand any traumas, to engage with them in therapeutic story writing, constructing their life stories, building their narratives, and building their capacity to use emotional language. All of those things come before the ability to self-regulate. So it's vital that every school has an authentic, connected, therapeutic adult who has the right kind of support and training themselves in order to be able to deliver that kind of intervention. That's a big ask, and something that I know you will be pondering on and thinking about today. And it has implications in terms of how that is funded. But given the new money, so-called new money, that's being offered at the moment, I think maybe this is something and an opportunity for us to reflect more deeply on how we go forward with that. There are challenges here. There are 3 C's. There are challenges in keeping ourselves well. There are challenges in the community in keeping others well, and challenges in maintaining supportive, positive relationships, not demonizing those who have found this last year more difficult, for example, than we have, particularly those members of the staff team who are experiencing heightened levels of stress and anxiety at this time. Keeping ourselves well is an essential, in my view. We can only teach, parent, or support when we are regulated. I've said this about 4 times in this keynote today. We need to think about our physical needs, intellectual needs, emotional needs, and support needs. This is not selfish, it's an essential. We need to nurture our empathic brain if we're going to be that therapeutic adult, that therapeutic support worker with that child or young person. So it's important to think about what you do in terms of how you actually nurture your empathic brain in these key 4 areas: your physical, intellectual, support, and emotional needs. So what do you do? Our pies, our 4 dimensions of ourselves. Take this away, this activity, please, with you, and write down what you're currently doing in those 4 areas. And if it's not enough, then talk about it with colleagues, talk about it with people that you love. It's really essential that staff begin to put themselves at the forefront now of ensuring that they look after themselves, that they engage in appropriate levels of self-care. We have to do this if we're going to carry on and nurture our children and young people effectively through this ongoing pandemic. Keeping others well at a whole school level, again, clearly an absolute essential. Relational safety. Let's not demonise the member of staff who finds this all much, much harder. Let's be very, very clear. There's a more need than ever before, I think, for compassion within our school communities. The supportive nature of those relationships are going to be the thing that actually helps us all to get through. We need to ensure that the school is a place of calm, that people feel in control, that they feel connected to one another, and that ultimately that there is a sense that there's some hope there, that we will be able to get through this time together. We will come out the other end. So at a whole school level right now, I think we need to focus on what we can control, retell those stories of our strengths, our children's strengths, our strengths, build that connection. And also for our staff teams, maybe daily we need to be thinking about collective self-care space for 20 minutes or so, or 10 minutes, whatever it is, in which we share skills, our strengths and ideas, our strategies, and we just focus on the positive, make that shift. So in terms of the whole school, both in the future and currently, I think we need to be looking at our wellbeing systems, the screening process that we use to ensure an effective continuum of support. Not all our children will need bespoke therapeutic intervention, as I said, but all of them will probably need at this juncture more support initially to just assimilate back in, to go through that change curve, to come out the other end and feel that they can access the curriculum, that they feel more confident, that they feel they have caught up both academically and emotionally. Paramount needs to be staff wellbeing, absolutely and essential, and the systems for that need to be very, very clear. And that involves training, I think, as well. So thinking very clearly, what is it that we're going to need in the future and now in order to continue to develop an approach which ensures the mental health and well-being of all, but also ensures that we develop more flexible blended learning options, which are more nuanced so that everyone is included. So supporting emotional well-being during and after lockdowns, and I'm not being negative here when I say that there are going to be obviously pockets of this that are going to be happening in certain areas of the country. This is not over yet, we know this. So it's very important that we have a framework for supporting emotional well-being during and after. So keeping in touch, reviewing our well-being and mental health provision, planning welcoming transitions, communicating our strategies for coping with well-being and mental health issues to the whole school, providing the appropriate training, providing signposts to appropriate online face-to-face help for our students and young people and staff members during and after lockdowns, establishing what this new normal is, making sure that it is compassionate, flexible, nurturing, trauma sensitive, and puts the safety, emotional well-being and safety of our children, young people and the adults in the school community first, and focusing on staff well-being continually. So my real recovery plan here, just to kind of summarise this really, is that I think that at this moment in time, real recovery, real catch-up looks very different from some of the narratives that we're hearing from government and via social media and the media in general. Rebuilding our connections is the essential, and maintaining and fostering emotional well-being has got to be our key focus in my view. This focus on our values and our strengths, on positives, ensuring that there is a sense of hope that we're giving to everyone, knowing that we can co-regulate, we know how to do it, knowing that we can regulate ourselves, acknowledging and supporting those bereavements, those losses and those changes, again, ongoing. This is a big ask, but we need to make sure that we do this and understand the unique nature of grief and the fact that it is not linear. Valuing our staff team, putting them first is absolutely essential. We can only share our calm when we have it ourselves. Knowing that education is a lifelong journey. We might have missed bits, we might feel worried about it, but we'll get through it. actually we're all behind, you know, we've all missed stuff. So let's just work together. Let's gradually get back into this. And the stuff that's happened to us in the past, those yesterdays, they're there to be learnt from. We now need to be really solution focused moving forwards. I'm really kind of thinking about how this is a safe space and how we can continue to make it a safe space, both physically and emotionally. Learning from each other's experiences, what went well, what was unique about our experiences, and building and reaffirming those attachments, those therapeutic relationships, those relationships with peers, those relationships with adults that really matter in terms of ensuring our well-being and our ability to once again access cognitive education, educational learning, what we're actually doing in that classroom on a daily basis. So in my view, it's about nurture for all within what I would call a resilient, flexible and compassionate community. So very, very important that we do this. This is what is going to pave the way, in my view, for well-being, engagement and success in all domains. So we need to catch up with real recovery, in my view, so that we can actually do this together. I want to reinforce a positive here. The Parent Ping Daily Survey did highlight, if you look at this graph, that actually many parents didn't think that there would be any significant difference to their children in the long term. They didn't think their future would be impacted in a huge way. This increased for our children aged 14 to 18, and that's important. And think about that logically, that is directly linked towards and directly linked to the examination process that they're all undergoing currently. But I think it is important to remember this. This is not going to be the same for all our children and young people. What we have to do is make sure that we recognise where each individual child and young person is on that anxiety continuum and give them the right kind of support. So in summary, I think it's vital that we reject this narrative of a lost generation, because what that does and what it is doing, in my view, for some of our children, young people, is actually just reinforcing levels of depression and anxiety, and it's taking away hope. And hope is the one thing, I think, in my view, that we really all need at this current time. Safety and nurture has to come first before any notion of academic catch-up. We need to clarify strategies for ensuring this sense of connection and safety. We need to ensure that those 3 A's are addressed. Everyone needs to understand anxiety, how to manage it. We need to make the learning, the opportunities that kids have, really truly accessible. And we have to ensure that we all feel attuned and safe within our communities. Children have access to those therapeutic type relationships that they need, those approaches that they need. We need to attune to each other in the best way possible. We need to ensure that we identify practical ways to make a real community thrive once again, that we feel connected to one another, that we know how to manage the difficulties that many experience. Our children, young people and adults need to know that their anxiety is acknowledged and it can be managed more effectively, that we can all co-regulate together. We also, as adults, I think, need to look after ourselves first. We need to find our calm so that we can share it. And that means as well developing in-house capacity for mental health support, stroke, catch-up. And I'm talking about mental health catch-up here. Really, really vital. How are we going to do that? What do we need in terms of training resources going forwards here? And I see this as an opportunity on one significant level. Out of every awful, tragic situation, there has to be post-traumatic growth. And I think it's really important that we learn from what went well. And for some of our children, young people, these more nuanced, flexible, blended learning opportunities have been magnificent in terms of them being able to thrive. So let's not just bin that now. Let's really look at it, what really worked, and think more flexibly about what we're doing. We have the opportunity to be creative here. Focus on this, focus on the creativity inherent in each child and adult. We need to get creative now, because then the real recovery really will happen. Let's flip the script. We've got a chance to do this. We've got a chance to actually flip the narrative here. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that this was something that actually will give the day a good start in terms of just highlighting the key issues, and hopefully will give you something to actually reflect on going forwards throughout the day. I know it's going to be an incredibly useful, informative day, and hopefully you will be taking away lots and lots of really useful ideas, tools and strategies that you can use straight away in your own context. So thank you very, very much for listening, and have a lovely, lovely day.